The unsurpassed, penetrating and perfect truth is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see and hear it. We can remember and accept it. I vow to make the Buddha's truth one with myself. Homage to the Buddha. Homage to the Dharma. Homage to the Sangha. Today we're going to talk about ceaseless practice. This is Great Master Dogen's longest chapter in the Shobogenzo. It's over 60 pages. And we're not going to go through the whole thing. We're just going to take up parts of it. But we'll talk about, use it for 2 talks. So part of it today and another part tomorrow. Great Master Dogen says, the great way of Buddhas and ancestors invariably involves unsurpassed, ceaseless practice. This practice rolls on in a cyclic manner without interruption. Not a moment's gap has occurred in their giving rise to the intention to realize Buddhahood, in their doing the training and practice, in their experiencing enlightenment, and in their realizing nirvana. For the great way of ceaseless practice rolls on just like this. It's all one thing, it's not in separate stages. Giving rise to the intention, doing the training, experiencing enlightenment, realizing nirvana. It's all one seamless thing. It's not cut up in separate stages. To realize nirvana, to realize something, as I said the other day, to make it real. It's not necessarily having some experience and then we understand everything and everything is fine and our problems have gone away. It's making it real for ourselves by putting it into practice. And we can do this. Throughout the whole Shobogenzo, Dogen makes it clear that training and enlightenment are one thing. To put the training into practice with our own body and mind is to practice enlightenment, to realize it, to make it real for ourselves, to put it into practice. And yes, he says experiencing enlightenment is part of it, but it's the practice that's important. And it's ceaseless. It rolls on just like this. He goes on, as a result, the practice is not done by forcing oneself to do it. And it's not done by being forced to do it by someone else. It is a ceaseless practice that is never tainted by forcing. The merits from this ceaseless practice sustain us and sustain others. We can't force ourselves to do it. And we certainly can't force someone else to do it. We have to want to do it. Otherwise we couldn't continue. The heart has to want to do it. We have to want to train ourselves to meditate, to keep to the precepts. And as we go on, more and more, we have to continue. We can't just stop. We know that this is what I need to do. Get stronger. Or sometimes it feels as though we are forcing ourselves because it's really hard sometimes. We're just feeling discouraged or we feel like we're just slogging through the desert. But still, when we look, there's actually this heart underneath that wants to do it, that knows this is the best thing to do, that keeps us going. The heart that seeks the way. Are good roots of training. To trust those, to keep coming back to the heart that seeks the way. And the merit of just keeping going, as he says, sustains us. We find the willingness to do it. And our faithful training helps others too. They can see it. It sustains us and it sustains others. Keeping going on the way. It's an inspiration to ourselves. It's an inspiration to other people. The more we do it, the more we want to do it. Even when it's hard, something in us knows we must not stop. The Tibetans have this dry little joke, better never to start Having started, better to finish. Well, we started. It's too late. Better to finish. Patience. Just going on steadily, ceaseless practice. When things are going well and when it's really hard. Patience is an underrated virtue. It doesn't look like much. But this longest chapter in the whole Shobogenzo is about this simple, ceaseless practice. It's not about having wonderful experiences or great things. It's about ceaseless practice, just going on steadily, faithfully, and never giving up. And this chapter is full of examples of people training themselves ceaselessly, often in very difficult circumstances. And all of them doing it a little differently. Some of them are doing it in much more austere ways than we would ever dream of. But they're an example of faithful, constant training through thick and thin, day after day, year after year. All a little differently. And this is part of Dogen's message in this chapter. There's no perfect way to train for everybody. It's not about the forms of training. The forms can help us, otherwise they wouldn't be there. But they're not the essential matter. They're there to help us. And all of these ancestors train in slightly different ways, as we'll see some of them. And nowadays we're living in a very different time and different circumstances from all those old masters in India and China and Japan. And yet human beings are pretty much the same. We still have the same problems. It's not that different. We still have to do our ceaseless practice. And how do we use our own circumstances to do our ceaseless practice in a way that works for us today and now? It'll be a little different for all of us. But one thing, sometimes a little discomfort or even a lot of suffering can be a help rather than a hindrance on the way. We just keep doing our ceaseless practice. So Dogen goes on. The underlying principle of this practice is that the whole universe in all 10 directions receives the merit of our ceaseless practice. Though others may not recognize it, though we may not recognize it ourselves, still it is so. As a result, owing to the ceaseless practice of all the Buddhas and ancestors, our own ceaseless practice has clearly manifested. And owing to our ceaseless practice, the ceaseless practice of all the Buddhas clearly manifests. And the great way of the Buddhas pervades everywhere. And owing to our ceaseless practice, the Buddha's way rolls perpetually onward. Accordingly, Buddha after Buddha and ancestor after ancestor have dwelt within Buddha, have acted from the heart of Buddha, and have fully manifested Buddha. And they have done so without a single moment's interruption. So we may not see this merit, the merit of our ceaseless practice, helping all beings, and others may not see it either, says Dogen. Nevertheless, it is so. The ceaseless practice of the Buddhas and ancestors helps us. It's helped us to get to this point. We're here because of their ceaseless practice, what they have passed down to us, that we have inherited. And our own ceaseless practice helps the Dharma to continue, to spread out, helps other beings. It spreads out both in time and in space. We are the inheritors of the Dharma. We practice it. It helps beings, whether knowingly or unknowingly, whether people see it or not. It still helps. There's still the ceaseless practice. Without a single moment's interruption, ceaseless practice continues. The life of Buddha continues. There's no separation between the training of the Buddhas and the training of ourselves. It's all the same thing. But they in the past were as we now are now, and we will be as they in the future. To do our ceaseless training is to practice our enlightenment. We're putting it into practice. If I was fully enlightened, this is what I'd be doing. We're practicing our innate enlightenment. We may not be doing it perfectly, we probably aren't, but we're doing our best. Now Dogen goes on, he kind of takes off. Due to this ceaseless practice, there is the sun, the moon, and the stars. Due to ceaseless practice, there is the great earth and the vast expanse of space. Here's Dogen has expanded our ceaseless practice to mean the life of Buddha, Buddha nature living through all things. Sometimes we see it, sometimes we don't. And it's not limited to us, to ourself, to our comings and goings, our births and deaths. The ceaseless practice is all-pervading. It's the life of Buddha. He says, due to ceaseless practice, there is body and mind, along with the internal effects of our past karma and the external conditions of our surroundings. Due to ceaseless practice, there are the 4 great elements and the 5 skandhas. The life of Buddha, Buddha nature, and the ceaseless practice of all those Buddhas, past, present, and future. They've allowed us to come into being with our karma and our circumstances, our inner and outer conditions. And we can do our own practice. It's all one thing. It's not us in our own little bubble doing my practice for myself and maybe a couple of other people. It spreads out, diffuses out everywhere. We can't keep it to ourselves, fortunately, nor would we want to. And again, we absorb the ceaseless practice of all other beings. Everybody absorbs the ceaseless practice of all other beings. He says sometimes the merit from that ceaseless practice no longer lies hidden. It can be seen. And as a result, the intention to realize Buddhahood arises along with training and practice. And sometimes that merit can't be seen. It doesn't show itself. So it's not encountered or perceived. Sometimes we see it, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we act on it, sometimes we don't. Sometimes it ripens in this life, sometimes it might ripen in another life. But we just keep on doing our best. And even if we don't see this merit of practice as Dogen, though it may be concealed from us at the present moment, the ceaseless practice that has brought us into existence is present in every single thought and thing. And we just do not realize that we are actually doing ceaseless practice, whether we know it or not. The merit that fills the universe, it pervades every single thought and thing. It's not limited to any person or any time or circumstance. It spreads out to everybody and everything, every single thought and thing, everything of our experience, everything we think, everything we see, everything that happens to us, everything we do. It's all part of ceaseless practice, whether we know it or not. And we need to do our ceaseless practice. We need to make it real for ourselves. The wheel of the Dharma rolls constantly, lacks for nothing, and needs something. It needs our ceaseless practice to continue. To see a flower opening or a leaf falling in the here and now is to fully see what ceaseless practice is. To see a flower opening or a leaf falling, this is to see impermanence. The flowers open, then they wither and die. Leaves fall. This is a very Japanese way of describing impermanence. Impermanence is Buddha nature, as Dogen says elsewhere. It is the flow of the life of Buddha. Everything that we see, do, and think is impermanent. All thoughts and things come and go, flow through. The life of Buddha is ceaseless practice, everything doing its ceaseless practice. Thus, he says, if anyone tried to set aside ceaseless practice, ignoring it in an attempt to conceal their wicked intention to escape from ceaseless practice, this too would be ceaseless practice. We can't get away from it. We can't get away from the life of Buddha. We can't get away from Buddha nature. And still, we need to put it into practice. We need to make it real for ourselves. Not to do our ceaseless practice, says Dogen, is like the sun in the Lotus Scripture. He loves the Lotus Scripture. He talks about it a lot. But in the Lotus Scripture there's this story of it's like the prodigal son. He wanders away from his father's house and gets lost, wanders for many, many years, wanders destitute, and then finally finds his way back home after many, many years, and in the end is reconciled with his father. This takes a long, long time. And yes, he does make his way back eventually, but it would have been a lot better, says Dogen, if he'd stayed home in the first place. He'd have saved himself and his dad a lot of grief. He does find his way home. It's like us. We wander away. Finally we find our way home. Let us find our way home sooner than later. And as Dogen says, this is why ceaseless practice is Dharma that is not to be neglected, even for a moment. Not to wander away, to stay home, to come back to our ceaseless practice. The life of Buddha pervades every single thought and thing. And we need to do our training. Now, Dogen gives us numerous examples of ancestors doing their ceaseless practice. We're not going to go through them all because there's a great many of them, but we'll talk about a few. And all these ancestors are doing it a bit differently, doing it in their own way, according to their own circumstances and their own characters, the way they need to train. He starts with Shakyamuni Buddha, who continued his ceaseless practice all his life. Up through the 80th year of his life, he was still doing ceaseless practice in the mountains and in the forests and in the monasteries. He wore his robes and he lived on alms. And he bore with patience the insults of non-Buddhas. Sometimes people were awfully rude. They'd come and try to defeat him in argument, and he'd bear with them patiently. He'd be polite. In sum, says Dogen, his whole life was ceaseless practice. Even the Buddha never stopped training. Always going on, always becoming Buddha. You can't just stop and say, okay, I've done it, I'm there, I'm enlightened, now I can relax. It's not like that. You have to keep on doing your training. And you want to do your training. The Buddha would never have wanted to go back, put his feet up and live in his father's palace. He just wanted to keep on being a simple monk. That's what he did. Magakashyo, his disciple, was a bit of an ascetic. And he practiced the 12 Zudas, the Dhutanga practices. They're pretty austere, living outside, wearing robes made from discarded rags, living in cemeteries, sleeping sitting up, and so on. There's various versions of these, but they're pretty austere. The Buddha himself didn't practice all these things. He'd done, the ascetic practices. He'd almost killed himself with ascetic practices before his enlightenment. So he didn't do all these things. But he let Magakashyo do it. And when Magakashyo was old, the Buddha suggested he back off a bit. He's getting old. You should maybe just want to do a little bit less of this stuff. Magakashyo very respectfully said he wanted to keep on doing what he was doing. And the Buddha praised him for that. This isn't a matter of willfulness. I'm going to keep doing what I want. But just, I feel it's good for me to do this. Okay, that's fine. It's not a matter of right and wrong. Maybe the Buddha was just giving him a way to ease up a bit if he wanted to, because he was getting old if he felt it was good to do. And Magakashyo wanted to continue. No argument, no conflict there. It's just Maybe he felt he needed those practices. There are monks to this day who do these Dhutanga practices, or some of the time they do. And it's not easy. Now we come to Daishugyo, the 10th Indian ancestor. He was old, almost 80 when he became a monk. Well, the story is that it was in his mother's womb for 60 years before he was born. Hard to quite credit. Maybe it means he was very attached to his mother. I don't know. Until he was 60, at least. But he didn't, start to train. He didn't become a monk until he was almost 80. So he's getting up there. A young man who lived in the area asked him, "You foolish, decrepit old man, how can you be so dim-witted? Besides, those who leave home life to become monks have two kinds of undertakings. First, they learn how to meditate. Second, they chant the scriptures. You are now feeble and senile, so there is no way for you to progress by doing either. To put it simply, you will carelessly muddy up the waters and will fill up your stomach with alms offerings to no purpose." The young man is not a monk himself. He just, The one of venerable ribs, upon hearing these rebukes and snide remarks, then thanked the man and made a vow, saying, "I will not let my ribs touch my mat until I have thoroughly mastered the fundamental meaning of the Tripitaka, cut off all craving for anything within the three worlds of desire, form, and beyond form, obtained the 6 marvelous spiritual abilities, and equipped myself with the 8 kinds of detachment from delusion." From that time on, there was not even one day that he did not practice walking and sitting meditation, as well as practicing mindful meditation while standing still. During the day, he investigated and learned the scriptures and their underlying principles. At night, he calmed his discriminatory thinking and cooled down his active mind. Continuing on in this way for 3 years, he explored and thoroughly mastered the Tripitaka, cut off his craving for the 3 worlds, and attained the wise discernment which arises from the 3 forms of clarity. People at that time, out of deep respect, gave him the name of the one of venerable ribs. It's so impressive. This young man makes these snide remarks saying, "You're just going to waste people's offerings. What use will you be? You'll just clutter up the place." And he thanks the young man. He's not discouraged and says, "Oh, well, you're probably right, not going to do it." And he's not resentful. He thanks him. Could we do this? I don't know. But he rises to the occasion and says, "Well, I'm going to do it. I'm going to train really hard and I'm going to make it. I'm going to perfect my training, realize the truth." It's really impressive. Dogen goes on, "Do not regret your reaching old age. It is difficult to know what this thing called life really is. Is a person really living or not really living? Is a person old or not old? The 4 perspectives are completely different. Or the various types of perspectives are different as well. We all have a different perspective on age. To a child, someone of 30 seems really old. And to somebody in their 80s, a person of 50 seems pretty young. So it's very, it's in the mind. And if we keep thinking, "I'm old, I'm too old for this kind of thing," well, then we are old. Old age is partly a state of mind. We don't need to go bungee jumping. Hopefully we have more sense. But we don't have to limit our willingness to train. We may not be able to make full bows on the ground, but we can still make full bows with the heart. But it's the willingness to train. Not to say, "Well, I'm too old for such and such." Not to limit ourselves. And most of all, we can be willing to learn, to change. to open up a new view. We might be stiff in body, but we don't have to be stiff in mind. It's really helpful for us, because it's easy to think, well, I think I'll just settle for a comfortable life. We can still train. We can still open up our view. We can still learn and change. And Dogen goes on, just concentrate on your intention and make your utmost effort to pursue the way. In your pursuit of the way, train as if you are facing a life and death situation. It is not simply your pursuit of the way within life and death. People today have become so foolish as to set aside their pursuit of the way upon reaching the age of 50 or 60, or upon reaching 70 or 80. Although we are naturally aware of how long we have lived, this is simply the human mind energetically engaged in discriminating and has nothing to do with studying the way. Do not concern yourself with being in the prime of life or having reached old age. Just be single-minded in exploring the way thoroughly and diligently. For then you will stand shoulder to shoulder with the one of venerable ribs. Do not be always lamenting the fact that you will end up as a pile of dirt in a graveyard. Do not spend your time worrying about it. If you do not single-mindedly devote yourself to reaching the other shore, who will rescue you? When people are aimlessly wandering about in the wilderness like skeletons without a master, they need to cultivate right perception so that they may fashion an eye for themselves, an eye of wisdom and compassion. Getting older can be a spur to our training. Ajahn Chah says this. He praises the old people in one of his talks. He says, you old people, you may not be able to sit as long as the young people, but you are really dedicated. You may not have a lot of time. We don't know how much time we have left. But we know it's getting shorter. We better get on with it. We may not be able to do all that we once could in the physical sense, but we can still train ourselves diligently. We can still do our ceaseless practice without forcing ourselves and without being forced by somebody else. The heart still wants to train. The heart is still young. It's not an old heart that says, I'm too old for this. Our heart is still bright and clear and does not age in that way. We can come back to that. Do our ceaseless practice with faith, willingness, and diligence in whatever situation we find ourselves in, whether we're old or young, whether we have good health or chronic pain or illness, whether we have some heavy karmic burden or we're fairly fortunate. We can consider, what is my ceaseless practice? We don't have to do some exotic and strenuous thing like sleeping in graveyards or never lying down. We can use the very circumstances of our lives, the problems we have right now, whether they seem to be large or small, dramatic or mundane, to learn acceptance and patience, stillness in the midst of our conditions, not kicking in against the pricks and arguing about it. Acceptance and patience. How do I deal with this? And gratitude for what we have. These little things of our lives that we think are an obstacle, they can be the very thing that helps us. We often tend to think, well, if I could just have this little burr out from under my saddle, or if I could just have this, or if I could just do that, maybe then I'd really be able to train. But actually, this is our training. This is the very grist of our training, our ceaseless practice, constantly dealing with our own body and mind, our own karmic inheritance, our own external and internal conditions, as Dogen says. We can do our meditation. We can do our best to keep to the precepts. We can continually take refuge in the three treasures, in faith, and ask for their help. This is our ceaseless practice. Homage to all the Buddhas in all worlds. Homage to all the Bodhisattvas in all worlds. Homage to the scripture of great wisdom.